Kenya, 1952. In this African colony, Britain faced the bloodiest revolt of its twilight years of empire. The enemy were African fighters who became known as Mau Mau. It was a war that would define how Britain fought against guerrilla enemies for the remainder of the century.
It's no good trying to fight a guerrilla organization like Mau Mau was by remaining purely a British infantry regiment. In fact, you've got to become a guerrilla yourself.
One man symbolized this violent resistance to British rule. To win the war, the British needed to hunt down Mau Mau leader, Dedan Kimathi.
His reputation with the British Army was as somebody who just couldn't be found, that he was a sort of will-o'-the-wisp. People thought he was almost supernatural.
Everybody wanted to get Dedan Kimathi. The Kenya regiment was after him, the police. If you could have got him, I thought I'd been sent home, everything would have been finished.
In 1952, Kenya was a rich and fertile country offering white settlers a lifestyle to dream of.
The life in Nairobi was very pleasant, very idle. Everything was done for us. And we played tennis and sort of made friends and had lots of dinner parties and general social life. And we were all very happy.
But a growing sense of discontent amongst the Kikuyu, Kenya's largest and most politicized tribe, was about to throw the country into crisis.
Kenya was a good place to live, and then suddenly there were these awful, gruesome, dreadful murders that took place.
In January 1953, Mrs. Ruck, a pregnant doctor who ran a clinic for Africans, her 6-year-old son Michael and her husband were attacked by Kikuyu at their isolated farmhouse.
The night before the murder, we were sent up on the top of the Aberdares, called back again, and the next morning we found the remains of the Rucks, which was an absolute shocker. There was Mr. and Mrs., son, and a little unborn.
The Rucks were hacked to death by machetes. It was the most notorious of several brutal murders of white settlers.
The Ruck murder really was the beginning of the taking the Mau Mau seriously.
In the settlers' houses, doors and windows are barred and bolted, where once they were never closed. And at sundown, the once trusted Kikuyu servants must leave the premises. They may be loyal, they may be traitors who would let the enemy in. All whites old enough to bear arms have a gun as their constant companion. There is little respite from this bitter and bloody struggle.
People in Kenya, particularly the settlers, were very, very frightened. They were advised to arm themselves. The women had to learn how to shoot with revolvers.
We always had them with us. I slept with it under my pillow. We had it on a table beside us while we were eating. There was this extraordinary feeling of people being afraid, this hysteria is a good word, I think, for the way we were behaving and acting.
The settlers' fears were well founded. Their comfortable way of life was now being challenged. Having fought and died alongside the British during the Second World War, many Kikuyu refused to accept a return to their pre-war status as politically powerless and socially excluded.
When we came back from fighting with the British in the Second World War, all we had to show for our sacrifice was a pair of army shorts. We didn't receive any real gratitude from the white people who we'd fought alongside, so we were very bitter.
There were rumours that there was a sort of restlessness and that the Africans were getting fed up with being dominated and told what to do by these sort of white people who were so much fewer than they were.
Documentary footage from the period reflects British government concern about this new radical spirit amongst the Kikuyu.
Revolutionary-minded Kikuyus like Kenyatta, part educated in Europe, ignored the fact that the government was teaching the Africans to make better use of their land. The agitators roused tribal grievances. They worked on the known credulity, suspicion and envy of the tribe. With the cry, "More land for the Kikuyu people," they distorted the true facts to insinuate that the whites had stolen land which belonged to the tribe.
A movement to negotiate self-rule and demand land back spread rapidly around the capital, Nairobi, and the Kikuyu heartland of the Aberdare Mountains. A 32-year-old primary school teacher called Dedan Kimathi was an early radical voice.
Kimathi was one of those people who had gone in the Second World War and had seen Europeans, white men being shot and dying just next to him in the fight.
Us blacks had never thought it possible to kill a white man, but during the war we'd seen white men dying. So when we came back, we decided that it was now time for us to see how white blood is shed.
For many years, we had talked to the white man about returning of our land. We had sent the delegations. The white man was turning a deaf ear. But Kimathi and those who were in the fight knew that the white man only listened to the sound of a bullet. And that's why they started organizing freedom fighters.
Groups of volunteer fighters began to form a secret organization, the Land and Freedom Army, which became popularly known as the Mau Mau. They began attacking whites and those Africans loyal to the British.
In Nairobi, capital of Kenya, Europeans and Africans still walk the streets in fear of the dreaded Mau Mau.
In October 1952, the colonial government responded by declaring a state of emergency. In what was to prove a huge tactical mistake, troops swooped on known Kikuyu leaders. Amongst those detained was Jomo Kenyatta, the moderate leader of the Kenyan African Union, the main political party seeking African self-rule. With Kenyatta's arrest, the resistance movement was left in the hands of young radicals.
These movements, full of corruption and virulent anti-white propaganda, had eventually to be outlawed by the government.
This left the country in darkness because the leadership had been removed, and now they started to look for new light, new leadership from the remaining group.
The new leadership fled to the dense forest in the Aberdares and formed gangs of fighters. Among them was the charismatic Dedan Kimathi.
Nyodo Kimathi are jaba Kimathi was so brave and fearless. He became our natural leader.
I felt joy and courage in my heart when I decided to fight the white man. Because Kimathi had explained how they were oppressing us. He told us that they were our biggest enemy, and if we wanted independence, then we had to fight the white man.
He was undoubtedly one of the first names you heard when we arrived. The first one of the first to make a real impact. And obviously had charisma and leadership, which rallied some of the Mau Mau supporters to him. One of the first, I think, to get into the forest and really establish a base there.
Dedan Kimathi, he was a sort of dreaded character. He depended enormously on witchcraft, on a prayer tree. He was, to them, a sort of godlike figure.
Kimathi drew on the Kikuyu tribe's religious beliefs to expand and unite the cause behind him. A respected spiritual leader in his community, Kimathi had performed oathing rituals before going to the forest.
There were various men who were appointed as oath administrators, and Kimathi was one of them.
Oathing had always been an integral part of Kikuyu culture, used for resolving conflicts and uniting the tribe. Breaking an oath was unthinkable.
They were far more frightened of breaking the oath, which meant pretty well instant death, than our bullets.
I went into the forest in January 1953 and found Kimathi. He said, "So you have come. You must now take another oath to slay all the white men here in our country." So I had to take a second oath vowing to kill all the whites until there was none left in Kenya.
To enlist the fighters that the Mau Mau urgently needed, oath administrators like Kimathi now recruited in the Kikuyu villages. Often they compelled people to take the oath, dragging them out of their huts in the dead of night.
The oath involved slaughtering a goat and mixing its blood with ours. Kimathi said this blood is what will empower us to drive the white man out of our land. We had taken a very solemn oath that could never be broken.
If he rejected to take the oath, he was beaten. Probably he accepts, and if he continues to reject, he might be even killed and hidden and buried and never to be seen again. Just a person disappeared, simple as that.
Mau Mau leaders also twisted traditional oathing ceremonies to bind these new recruits to their cause.
Before an oathing ceremony, we'd gather everything together and wait in a hut.
Finish.
We had to protect our identity from potential enemies. Everyone would be sworn to secrecy till death.
They were all beginning to take these oaths, which we heard about. I think they started with a fairly simple one, then they got really horrid and sort of mixed up with sort of sex and animals.
The Mau Mau oath ceremony pledges the initiates to do the Mau Mau's bidding in its campaign against Christianity and against law and order.
The British were able to make great capital out of the undeniably grotesque nature of many of these Mau Mau oathing rituals.
There was one which I remember involved consuming menstrual discharge and human flesh at some stage or another. The purpose of the oaths were to demean somebody to such an extent. You separated yourself from the rest of society and you joined forces in a sort of brotherhood with your fellow Mau. So it was entrance to a club, if you like, or entrance to a sect, a society, a terrorist society.
They were usually drugged. There was a certain kind of drug that the women knew how to make. It was made from bark of acacia trees. And this was used by the warriors traditionally for when they went into battle.
Mau Mau fighters, drugged or otherwise, were now capable of committing large-scale atrocities. In March 1953, some 3,000 Mau Mau overran the village of Lari, home to a loyalist chief.
These pictures arrive from Kenya. They show the charred remains of the village of Lari, only 30 miles from Nairobi, where over 120 loyal Kikuyu were massacred by Mau Mau terrorists. Men, women and children perished in a night of savagery almost beyond description. An entire village was turned into a smouldering funeral pyre.
I think Kimathi was responsible for the Lari massacre. And certainly he was the man who the settlers viewed as the most dangerous of our immediate opponents. And I think we thought the same.
On the same night, another Mau Mau gang attacked a police station in the town of Naivasha.
When we first arrived in Naivasha, we attacked the home guards at the gate. We then broke into the station and Kimathi instructed us to handcuff anyone we found on the ropes. He said these were the people who were standing in our path to independence. They were home guards, black Africans who were fighting on the white man's side. We also looted many weapons, including guns, and took some 200 people hostage.
Kimathi's ability to organize and command two such audacious attacks on the same night left the colonial authorities reeling.
Kimathi led the attack on Naivasha police station, but he was also the one who ordered his generals to attack the other place so as to prove to the colonial authorities that we were a force to be reckoned with, capable of driving the white man out of our country.
Kimathi's twin attacks on Lari and Naivasha shocked the world. They also demonstrated that Africans loyal to the British were as much a target of Mau Mau violence as white settlers. The Kikuyu tribe was being torn apart. Many now flocked to join the loyalist Home Guard to try and end what was fast becoming a civil war.
There were two kinds of people in Kenya, the Mau Mau and the Home Guards. People like me, who were Home Guards, did not agree with what Kimathi was doing. We were at war, and had I run into Kimathi, either he would have killed me or I would have killed him.
Despite growing opposition and their lack of arms and military expertise, the Mau Mau still held the initiative. No one could get close to their strongholds in the forest. And their passive wing, those silent supporters living in the Kikuyu villages and towns, were providing the fighters with plenty of food and supplies.
In the early days, life was good because people had clothing, had food, had all supplies they wanted with them. people in the forest, I mean freedom fighters in the forest, could run into the farm, drive hundreds of cattle into the forest, kill them, butcher them. They have a lot of meat to eat.
With Mau Mau confidence soaring, Kimathi now awarded himself a knighthood and the military title of Field Marshal. He was fast becoming a legendary figure for the British Army, as well as amongst the Mau Mau themselves.
You could cover enormous distances. You'd be sighted in one place, then suddenly sighted in another.
When he moved from one place to another, he would be bent double going through these animal tracks. He was travelling those distances, quite very similar in a way to the way an animal travels. Incredible man.
As well as his reputation for brutality, Kimathi also had a wicked sense of humour and enjoyed taunting his enemy.
During Christmas, Kimathi wrote a letter and put his photograph in and gave a soldier to take it to the army camp. He said that you have been hunting for me, maybe you do not know how I look like. Here I leave you with my photograph. This is his own handwriting. How did it come here at night? It was a puzzle to them. It was a puzzle to them. But we all know that, yes, inside the camp, there's our agent there.
Everybody wanted to get Dedan Kimathi. The Kenya regiment was after him, like the police. Everybody wanted him. He was like number one. He was like the Mau Mau boss. And I always thought he was like second to Jomo Kenyatta, but Jomo Kenyatta was in prison.
Britain's answer was to fight the Mau Mau with tactics more appropriate to World War II. A huge bombing campaign was launched to try and flush Kimathi and his gangs out of the forest.
This is the Lincolns.
That's right. We was at the top of a hill. You could see very clearly these planes coming over, dropping all these bombs. And I remember saying to, it was Ned then, who was my platoon commander. I said, the animals are going to have the hump when we go in there after all that lot coming down on them, aren't they?
This bomb never actually killed people. There were people hurt, but not killed. But these bombs were killing animals, wild game, elephant, buffaloes and all that, the big herds, only just to supply us with the wild meat to eat. Yes.
We'd light a big fire and then all run off. The British would then bomb the place thinking we were camped there, but we'd long gone. After the bombing had finished, we returned to the same place, knowing full well that there would be no further attack.
The World War II bombers proved ineffective, and the military tactics employed on the ground were equally out of date.
There's no doubt that the first 18 months of the emergency, the Mau Mau had the upper hand. It was extraordinary how they did it with just spears and sometimes homemade weapons, but they did, and the European morale suffered a good deal.
Our generals and officers set over us reckoned that you could treat the Mau Mau like beating pheasants through a wood. You put a line of beaters in the top, and all the Mau Mau would run away in front of you, and then you'd have a line of guns at the bottom and you would shoot them. Well, of course, the Mau Mau had different ideas to that, and it was, from a platoon commander's point of view, a complete disaster.
Well, I'm still adopting the sort of tactics which had always been used by the British Army, i.e. the enemy are in there, we've got to get rations in, we've got to get logistics in, we've got to get wirelesses in, we've got to get headquarter sections in to this forest, and so we must cut mule tracks.
We used to do forest patrols, and we never saw a Mau Mau, because they would always see us long before we got anywhere near them. They could smell us, in fact. Obviously, we had soap, and they could smell the cleanliness. And if we were drinking coffee, they know, you know, having a coffee or a smoke, they would smell that from in the forest miles away. And certainly they could hear us, because we had no idea of going through the forest quietly. So it was totally the wrong tactics.
These were demoralizing times for the colonial authorities. Policemen like Peter Swan were on the front line night after night.
The frustration of seeing that Mau Mau seemed to be able to move in and out of our area with impunity. On one occasion, at least, they hamstrung an old couple. They couldn't move out of the circle of fire they were in, and they'd been burnt to death. It was quite gruesome. And they were also there in the habit of cutting open the bellies of women and removing unborn children.
I can still smell, in a way that smells live with you, one of the villages that was right close to the forest edge, and the Mau Mau had surrounded it and set fire to it. A number of people had been burnt alive, and we got there just too late to save them. And I can still smell the smell of those bodies, which was it is a terrible smell.
The continued success of the Mau Mau was causing growing embarrassment to the British. A radical change in tactics was needed.
Well, there obviously had to be a better way, because what was happening wasn't working. It's no good trying to fight a guerrilla organization like Mau Mau was by remaining purely a British infantry regiment. You've got to change and adapt a lot of their methods for your own use.
It was really by accident that change eventually came about. Intelligence officer Eric Holyoake came up with a seemingly preposterous discovery, but one which would have a lasting impact on how Britain fought against guerrilla forces.
We were out on a pseudo patrol one night to get information, and my men had gone into the hut to speak to one of the contacts, and I was in the background. I felt that I was going to be compromised, so I got down and it had been raining, and there was some mud there, and I just plastered it all over my face. Having done that, we captured two of those terrorists. And they hadn't realized that we weren't Mau Mau, which was quite funny. And from there, the idea came into fruition.
This simple idea, passing himself off as a Mau Mau, offered Eric Holyoake the chance finally to infiltrate the Mau Mau gangs in the forest. This would require a convincing disguise and the expertise of recently captured Mau Mau fighters.
When we went into the forest, we were guided by people who we'd recently arrested. They had the most accurate information about the whereabouts of Mau Mau hideouts. We couldn't leave Eric and the other white men behind because they were the ones with guns. After that, we thought of a way to disguise the white men.
I'm black, all my face and my neck and my hands up to my wrists. They didn't even realize that I was a white man.
Do you really think this is going to work?
I would have to stick corks up my nose with little holes in them to flatten it, and look in the mirror, make sure that there was nothing that looked as though it was anything European. And of course we had to wear Mau clothes.
We all went in with the absolute minimal civilized equipment, just like an African, just like primeval man, really.
British soldiers would black up their faces and come into the forest.
I used to keep in the background even although I was blacked. I wouldn't sort of be the front runner. You know, one tried to keep in the background, but it worked, and it was so easy.
It was a complete, utter novelty and something I would have thought had never been practiced before. Tracking down terrorists by behaving more and more like they behave themselves, and you vastly increase the chances of contacting them and achieving your objective.
If we bumped into a Mau Mau gang, they wouldn't recognize him or realize he was white. If they had, they would have killed us.
Kibera and other former Mau Mau fighters held the key to the success of the pseudo-gangs.
Inside the forest, there were secret signals by which Mau Mau gangs used to communicate with each other. We taught Eric all of these. We had a special greeting where we would pinch each other's palms and we would say something like, when we ran into the Mau Mau, we would say to them, "Tss, tss," 3 times. They would then think we were part of their gang.
We all traipsed off into the forest, led by somebody who knew where this hideout was going to be. We would have this chap with a piece of string tied round his neck who would be leading us to this hideout. If we wanted to surprise them, we would simply go in as a gang and sit down beside the fire and kick the fire and make all the sparks come up. We would try to get the leader of the gang to come out with us. Our ex-Mau Mau, who would be known to them probably because they might well have come out of the same gang, would say to them, "Why do you carry on like this? I get fed by these Europeans. I have a lovely bed at night, I have a woman beside me. What are you going to do? Are you going to end your days here as a carcass being eaten by hyenas? Or are you going to come back with us and sire a lot more daughters and make yourself a lot more wealthy?"
In the forest, the information I would be getting would be for the security forces. Obviously, we captured people because we could then turn them and put them into gangs.
At last, the British had found a way of breaking into the Mau Mau strongholds in the forest. And the real gangs had no idea who they could trust.
It was very difficult to know who had surrendered and who had not. It was heartbreaking to find someone you had fought with now hunting you down or telling you to surrender.
There were these turncoats, people who had once fought with us in the forest. They were a big blow to our struggle. They dressed just like they were still part of our gang. But they betrayed us to our enemies.
Having adapted the Mau Mau's guerrilla tactics to their own end, the British were now gaining vital intelligence on the whereabouts of the elusive Dedan Kimathi. And success was not long in coming.
How did you find his hideout?
I was following one set of tracks, and for quite a long way, and we suddenly came upon this great collection of very elaborate bamboo buildings, which we'd never seen anything like before. Mau Mau didn't usually build anything like that, you know.
No.
But this was just a symptom that Kimathi's people had been in there, living on the fat for some time. There was a commander's conference table, and there were documents there which were the minutes of the so-called parliament. I think it was Dedan Kimathi's, and it was all evidence that they had been left undisturbed. It was darn cheeky, you know, of Kimathi to have made such a great big bamboo government house.
What was so important from the intelligence point of view, we captured the minutes of what was called the Mount Kenya Parliament. It upset Kimathi very considerably.
Kimathi wrote everything in those books. He recorded all our plans and attacks in them. Somebody who had surrendered stole those books and gave them to the white man. We came back and found them missing from our hide.
The day after Government House had been raided and the documents taken, Kimathi launched a counterattack with orders to recover the books.
Kimathi was furious this had happened, and so he said to his braves, "You must go and get them back." And that led to the only time, really, when we had a stand-up battle with the Mau Mau.
5 riflemen found this little forester's hut, and they decided that it's a bit of good fortune and they'd hole up there for the night instead of making a bamboo basha. And one of them went out to do a pee, and somebody shot at him. And then more shots and more bullets, and then they started turning fire.
It was obvious that this was a serious attack, and that had never happened before. Mau Mau had never attacked us because why should they?
Quite a battle continued through the night. I think it ended love all, because I don't think there were any casualties on either side. They certainly didn't get their documents back, and so Kimathi must have been hopping mad.
You don't realise it's the Kenyan people you're hurting. Your people.
A new approach to intelligence gathering was also tightening the net around Kimathi's fighters. A detailed picture of the enemy was being constructed from interrogations of Mau Mau prisoners.
When a Mau Mau was brought to the camp, he would first of all be, treated as a prisoner. He would be kept in a hut and kept an eye on. And then the people that worked for me would speak to him and talk to him and try and persuade him. Slowly, we would give them a meal and allow them to wander around, give them a cigarette, and slowly get their confidence. Once we felt that they were capable, then we would take them on a patrol with us, and they would be treated just exactly the same, except they wouldn't initially be given a weapon to carry.
Second,
people mostly changed sides because of money and cowardice. They were promised a life of luxury by the white man, which was very enticing after years suffering in the forest. These people should be very embarrassed today.
Today,
To To them, it was just a better deal. A better life, really, I think. It was rather like them changing sides in England when they swapped from one football team to the next.
The informer system that Eric and his colleagues had initially devised in their pseudo-gangs was later used on a mass scale by the British. Informers with hoods covering their faces were used to identify known Mau Mau fighters or sympathizers.
We would have a good informer, and we'd put all the captured terrorists in a long line, and the hood would whisper, that's so-and-so, or he's a bad guy, he's not a bad guy, he's a good guy. And the sum total was, you know, if 5 people said he was a bad guy, then he went to one side. If one bloke said he was a bad guy, then it was a bit suspect, because it might have been a case of, I didn't like him too much. They were very effective, those hooded people, very effective.
They had hoods over their heads so nobody could see what they were like, and they sort of went here and here and here, and that's how they decided who to put in the camp and who wasn't a Mau Mau.
In all, more than 80,000 Kikuyu were detained during the emergency, identified through a variety of methods. The hooded man technique, as it became known, would go on to be used controversially by the British in Northern Ireland and elsewhere. In general, intelligence and undercover operations changed the course of this war and would influence British counter-terrorist policy for decades.
If you look at it historically, I would have thought it was a turning point. It is a vastly important way of tackling terrorism. And the seed was sown in Kenya, and it's grown from there. And it is now, as far as I'm aware, British Army policy.
Along with this shift towards more guerrilla-like tactics, there was also, at times, a disturbing ruthlessness among the colonial forces.
One of the problems was that if you wounded somebody, you couldn't, it was no possibility of bringing him out. Absolutely no. We were maybe 5 or 6 hours from the forest edge, and you couldn't carry somebody that distance. This was a problem which I'm afraid I always left to the Africans themselves. They didn't seem to mind finishing the person off, which was a horrible, horrible thing to have to do. But there was no alternative, absolutely no alternative. One had to get as much information from the poor chap before you finished him off, but that was all that could be done.
Dead Mau Mau needed to be identified, however brutal the method employed.
It's very, very difficult to roll fingerprints when the body's got rigor mortis. I was very fortunate. I had a full corporal, who had worked in Nairobi, and he came down, he got a flat stone, put the hand on the flat stone, then stamped on the hand, so all the fingers broke, and you could then roll the fingerprints nice and neatly. Standard of fingerprints going up to CID was upsetting them, so they asked permission from headquarters if hands could be cut off and brought down, because they said it was dangerous for us to carry bodies down from the mountain in case we got ambushed. So that's what we used to do. We used to cut the hands off.
When a home guard presented the colonial authorities with a Mau Mau's hand, he'd be paid 200 shillings. Now, if you know you are going to get paid, you are going to find any all-innocent person, kill them and claim they were a Mau Mau.
The forest and its surrounding areas became prohibited zones where anyone could be shot on sight. Some British battalions started keeping scorecards of kills and offering rewards.
I know of at least one where the station commander, his score kept escalating, kept getting higher and higher, and I'm saying, how the hell does he do it? Because it was hard work. But it was fed back to me that he wasn't actually going out on patrol much. He'd go out and into the local village area there, and he'd wait for somebody to come out and have a pee at night and shoot them.
The statistical evidence only added to mounting concern about how the war against the Mau Mau was being waged. Within 6 months of the declaration of the emergency, 430 men had been officially shot dead while trying to escape. Over the next 8 years, more than 1,000 suspected Mau Mau were hanged by the British. Mobile gallows moved around the country to process these hangings quickly. With pressure mounting at home and abroad, the British needed to bring the conflict to a swift close. On the 24th of April 1954, many of Nairobi's inhabitants were rounded up before dawn. Thousands of Mau Mau suspects were detained without trial, instantly cutting off the flow of recruits, arms, food and supplies into the forest.
This operation arrested more than 100,000 people from Nairobi city alone. And all young men were arrested so that they do not go and join the fighters in the forest, and they were detained. If we don't get supply, we are not getting ammunition, we are not getting stuff, we will be weaker.
At the same time, people living around the forest fringes were forced to move into specially built enclosed camps, a technique first developed in Malaya, but only after having been officially de-oathed, freed from the Mau Mau bond by loyal oath administrators. This policy of villagization, where people could be forced to live under 23-hour curfew, led to the complete isolation of the forest gangs. They were no longer able to make any contact with their passive wing, which so successfully supplied them in the early years. Their battle now was one for survival.
I can't begin to explain all the suffering we went through. By this time, food had become so scarce and we were forced to eat bark from trees. We would chew it until it became finer than flour. We would chew any bones we could find, whether they were animal or human ones. When our food supply finally dried up, we would cut a piece of the skin from our clothes, roast it and eat it.
As the situation for gangs in the forest deteriorated, Kimathi's behavior towards his own people became increasingly severe, even irrational. He began to punish or kill his men for the most minor breach of camp rules.
Some of the captured terrorists would say how they were beaten for doing little things that to us wouldn't be very important, but to Kimathi's gangs were important. So some of the misdeeds were so ridiculous that I can't even recall. But it would have been something like talking out of turn, or coming into a hut which you shouldn't have been. And if there were women in a camp, fraternizing was one of the biggest punishments.
By the end of 1955, there were only a few hundred fighters left in the forest. Kimathi remained the only leading Mau Mau general still at large, and the hunt for him intensified.
As far as Kimathi was concerned, it was obviously, he was our prime target, and it would have been very nice if we had been able to capture or kill him. But it was, I always thought, very, very appropriate that it was a tribal police unit that got him in the end.
On the 21st of October 1956, Dedan Kimathi was shot and captured by tribal policemen on the edge of the Aberdare forest. Some say he was betrayed by his own supporters.
I think Kimathi was betrayed by his own persons or groups who were working with him. For one thing, there was still this 10,000 tag for his head.
By this time, Kimathi had become unpopular, even among his own people, because so many people were getting killed, and Kimathi had repeatedly refused to surrender. The war had reached a point where people just wanted it to end.
I just heard a gunshot and ran to see what was going on. I saw Kimathi lying at the spot where he'd been shot. I tore off my shirt and wrapped it around his leg where he had been shot. He was then taken away. So many people had gathered and saw him being taken off to jail.
When I heard that Kimathi had been shot, I immediately went to see him. He was asked if he wanted a cup of tea, and he replied that he'd only take it if it was made by Priscilla. He had lost a lot of blood, so he asked me for an aspirin, which I got for him. After he was taken to Ihururu, I never saw him again. I was devastated that he had been shot.
First time I saw him was down in the hospital.
Peter Swan was put in charge of guarding Kimathi.
He had leopard skin clothing and had fine features, had a fine, strong face. But he wasn't saying anything to anybody. Kimathi was taken out in front of the press. There was quite a number of press around. They all came up trying to get photos here, there and everywhere. He was obviously very, very angry.
When I heard that Kimathi had been caught, I couldn't eat anything all day. It suddenly felt like the white man would never leave Kenya, and he would never be free. I feared we would never gain our independence without Kimathi.
Within a month of his capture, Kimathi's trial was underway. He was charged with a capital offence of possessing a firearm.
Kimathi felt he was going to be found guilty. He also expected to be sentenced to hang. Kimathi felt that he would not be hung. He was convinced of that. Kimathi, I think, felt there would be some divine providence would come in.
But Kimathi was found guilty and sentenced to death. His wife was allowed one last visit.
I found him very healthy and calm. He was not afraid, and he said he was ready to face death. He told me he would never surrender, even if that meant dying. He would never betray his country.
Kimathi was executed on February the 18th, 1957, some 6 years before Kenya gained independence. Despite his wish for a public hanging, he was hanged in secret and buried in an unmarked grave.
My attitude was a man who's caused such misery to his own people, as well as difficulties for ourselves, and had caused the death directly or indirectly of some 10,000 Kikuyu. One can't exactly mourn his death.
Kenya and the rest of the world should honor Kimathi because he died fighting to liberate this country.
The state of emergency in Kenya was to last another 3 years. But with Dedan Kimathi dead and buried, so too was the spirit of rebellion.
Kimathi foretold that this country would gain its independence, and that is what we are enjoying now in his absence.
Over 10,000 Mau Mau fighters and supporters were killed during the emergency. Another 2,000 Kikuyu died at the hands of the Mau Mau. But perhaps the most surprising statistic of all is that in this war aimed initially at the European population in Kenya, the number of settlers actually killed was just 32, fewer than died in road accidents in Nairobi during this period.
Even though many people died, I think what the Mau Mau did was worth it. As we all know, nothing comes easy or without taking drastic action. The Mau Mau did something drastic.
Last year, the government in Kenya officially recognized the Mau Mau as freedom fighters. Veterans are now calling for Kimathi's body to be located and given a hero's burial.
I'm horrified to hear them classed as freedom fighters because they were fighting against their own and against other tribes as well.
I think, in fairness, one's got to give Kimathi credit for being a pretty good leader on his own level. I think he was a very brave man. He was certainly, obviously, very much respected by his people who worked with him. You could see that. Now, I think we had a good deal of respect for him.
Kenya would never have been liberated had we not gone to fight in the forest. Our flag only flies today because so many people sacrificed themselves and shed their blood.
However, there is still no place in Kenyan history for those Africans who fought against the Mau.
I thought fighting against the Mau Mau was the best way of restoring peace in our country and ending all the killing in the forest. We deserve a lot of respect as we were the people who were trying to arbitrate between the warring parties, trying to restore peace in Kenya.
The tactics developed by Britain's empire warriors in Kenya and elsewhere, the use of intelligence, the adoption of guerrilla methods, the focus on winning hearts and minds, and the ruthless deployment of special powers were to re-emerge in later conflicts. British military thinking in Northern Ireland, the Balkans, and even in Iraq all owe a debt to these earlier wars fought during the final years of the British Empire.
Tua mau